Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
Good day to our members from Austria, Canada, Hong Kong, Israel, India, Lesotho, Lithuania, Pakistan, and the USA. It's episode 45. Let's get into it. Here's the thing that ties this week together. Every threshold in life has a number posted on it, and that number is almost never the real one. The down payment isn't the cost of the house. The poverty line isn't the line between comfortable and not. An election result isn't the same thing as governing. So we've built the whole episode around entry costs. In what you didn't see in the news, we've got diamonds melting at 3 times the pressure of Earth's core, a microcap running a Tourette trial across 3 countries, 100% tariff on foreign drones that repriced an entire sector overnight, a license plate camera company blinking under public pressure, counterfeit squishy toys getting stopped at the port, 40 gold bars behind a brewery wall in Belgium, a Social Security estimate that keeps falling, war risk premiums in the Strait of Hormuz that have gone up roughly 30-fold, entry-level jobs vanishing until only 1 in 50 openings is won, streaming platforms, writing checks for video podcasts, and a quiet piece of market infrastructure most people have never heard of. Then Wake Up Ready walks you through the Fed minutes, 3 days of retail earnings, a biotech IPO window that just proved it's open, and an oil choke point that's still choked. After that, a knowledge bomb about the number that actually gets you into a house, and it isn't the one you think. A humor me about how many ways America has invented to describe being broke. A greater debate between Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt about who gets to run the government after the voters have voted. And let's invent again, where a patient chemist in Illinois spent 3 years and 200 failed compounds figuring out how to make people cross the threshold of consciousness without it feeling like a siege. Different rooms, same doorway. Somebody always pays to get through it. The only question is whether they saw the bill coming.
Let's go.
Each week we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. Let's start with the hardest substance we know how to make, and what happens when you stop respecting it. Researchers at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory published results in Nature Physics this week showing what diamond actually does when you shock compress it to pressures roughly 3 times what exists at the center of the Earth, at temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. And the answer is strange. Diamond holds its crystal structure right up to the instant it melts, and then the carbon atoms just collapse into disorder all at once. There's no gradual softening, no warning, it's rigid, and then it's a liquid metal. Here's the detail that makes it stick. Solid diamond floats in that liquid carbon. It bobs on top of it, the way ice cubes float in a glass of water, which is exactly the kind of behavior that scrambles your intuition because the solid form of most materials sinks in its own melt. Water is the famous exception. Now, carbon joins it under conditions you'd have to travel to Neptune to find naturally. Why it matters is that this resolves 2 long-standing gaps between what the experiments showed and what the quantum simulations predicted, which means the models people use to design fusion targets have been running slightly wrong for years. Livermore's own estimate is that applying this correctly to inertial confinement fusion could roughly triple energy gain. Second order, it also rewrites the interior models of Uranus and Neptune, where oceans of liquid carbon with diamond icebergs floating in them are now a live scientific proposition rather than a metaphor. It surfaced this week because the paper dropped, and because the phrase, "scientists melted a diamond," is the rare science headline that survives contact with the internet.
3 years of failed models corrected by 1 experiment. The expensive part of physics is never the equipment. It's finding out where your assumptions were quietly wrong.
That same pattern of quiet, expensive testing shows up in a place most investors never look. On August 5th, a company called Neurothera Labs, the subsidiary of a NASDAQ-listed microcap called SciSpark, opened a Phase 2b trial site at the Yale Child Study Center for an adult Tourette syndrome treatment. 3 weeks earlier, on July 15th, the same trial went live at Hanover Medical School in Germany. There are sites in Israel, too. 1 small company, 3 countries, 1 question. The candidate is called SCI-110, and it combines dronabinol with palmitoyl ethanolamide, aiming at tick severity while trying to keep the side effects tolerable. The design is randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover in adults 18 to 65, measuring tick severity at weeks 12 and 26 on the Yale Global Tick Severity Scale. Earlier Phase 2A data showed an average tick reduction of about 21%. Here's the texture. Tourette syndrome has no modern purpose-built drug. What's prescribed instead are antipsychotics developed for entirely different conditions, borrowed because they happen to suppress tics, with metabolic and sedative costs that many patients decide aren't worth it. So the actual competitor here isn't another drug. It's the number of people who've quietly opted out of treatment altogether. Why it matters is that the economics of a condition affecting roughly 1 in 100 children are marginal enough that Big Pharma has largely skipped it, which leaves the work to companies with a market cap smaller than a suburban office park. Second order, SciSpark's ticker has been running relative volume in the hundreds of times its trailing average, which tells you retail found the trial before the sell side did. It surfaced this week because the Yale site announcement propagated out of the trade press and into retail scanners, roughly a week after the filing.
The market cap says nobody's paying attention, and the volume says somebody just started.
Which brings us to a case where the entry fee got set by proclamation. On August 14th, the Trump administration invoked Section 232, the national security provision of the Trade Expansion Act, to put tariffs of up to 100% on foreign manufactured drones. Military grade and heavy systems over 25 kilograms take the full 100. Commercial drones take 25%. Both start September 3rd. European-made drones got capped at 15. According to CNBC, domestic drone names rallied immediately on the news. Red Cat Holdings climbed about 7 to 8%, AeroVironment gained roughly 3%, Kratos moved with them, and the small-cap component supplier Unusual Machines jumped somewhere between 22 and 25% in a single session. Here's the texture, and it's the part that should make you sit up. Red Cat had reported second quarter results 8 days earlier. Revenue of $20.2 million, up 527% year over year, and still a miss against a consensus of $22.8 million. The stock rallied anyway, which tells you the market has stopped valuing these companies on execution and started valuing them on the height of the wall being built around them. Why it matters is that a tariff is a transfer, not a creation. Somebody pays it. In this case, every American agriculture, inspection, mapping, and public safety operator whose fleet just got more expensive to replace. Second order, with an effective date of September 3rd, expect a visible pull forward of foreign drone imports over the next 2 weeks, followed by an air pocket. It surfaced this week because the proclamation landed midweek and the entire small-cap drone complex repriced overnight before most people had read the exemptions.
When a stock goes up on a revenue miss, you're not buying the business, you're buying the policy, and policies get revised.
Another story gaining momentum this week involves a different kind of boundary, the one between you and a camera you didn't know was there. Flock Safety, the Atlanta company that operates one of the largest automated license plate reader networks in the country, announced a set of platform changes this week in response to sustained public backlash. Thousands of law enforcement agencies across 49 states can search and share Flock's data, and reporting over the past year has documented cases of that access being used well outside its stated purpose. The concrete change, CEO Garrett Langley said guardrails that used to be optional will become mandatory by January 1st, including a requirement that every law enforcement customer implement an audit tool designed to flag abnormal search behavior. That's a company voluntarily narrowing its own product because the pressure got expensive. The texture here is where the pressure came from, not Congress and not a regulator. A grassroots group called DFlock built a site called Have I Been Flocked, which lets anyone search reported scanner density by county and see how heavily their own community is surveilled. Search interest in that phrase has been climbing several 100%, mostly from people typing in their zip code to find out how many cameras they drive past on the way to work. Why it matters is that this is a rare case of a privacy outcome produced by public legibility rather than legislation. Make the invisible thing countable, and the politics follow. Second order. Every company operating an ambient sensor network is now watching to see whether a searchable public map becomes the standard tool of accountability. It surfaced this week because Flock made the announcement and because the deflock tool crossed from local news curiosity into national search volume.
The fastest route to regulation these days isn't a bill. It's a website that lets people count the thing nobody wanted counted.
Speaking of things getting counted, let's go to the port. On August 5th, the Consumer Product Safety Commission issued a consumer safety alert about fake and counterfeit squishy toys, the soft, sensory fidget toys that have become a fixture in kids' backpacks. The numbers are the story. CPSC has identified 55 separate shipments of violative squishy toys at U.S. ports, and working with Customs and Border Protection, stopped 355,683 units from entering the country. The hazards named are not subtle. Failures against federal requirements covering water beads, small parts, lead, and phthalates. In June, the UK's Product Safety Agency recalled a knockoff squeezy dumplings toy after inspectors found benzene in the outer layer at roughly 4 times the legal limit. Poison control centers, including Pittsburgh's, have been fielding calls from parents. Here's the texture, and it's the part most coverage missed. The market didn't stop wanting squishies. It substituted. Search and view velocity for do-it-yourself squishy tutorials on YouTube has accelerated sharply, in some measures overtaking the long-dominant homemade slime category. Parents who read a benzene headline don't stop buying a category. They start making it in the kitchen, which is its own uncontrolled supply chain. Why it matters is that enforcement at the border creates a demand vacuum, and vacuums get filled by whatever's cheapest and least regulated. Second order. The DIY substitution is now the safety surface nobody is inspecting. It surfaced this week because the CPSC alert propagated through parenting networks and consumer press about 10 days after it dropped, which is roughly the half-life of a product warning.
Ban the import, and you don't kill the demand, you just move the factory into somebody's kitchen and take the inspector out of the room.
Now for something with no policy implications whatsoever, and I'm including it because sometimes the world is just good. In Sint-Gilles-Dendermonde, Belgium, a crew installing sewer lines under a former brewery broke through a cellar wall and found a wooden chest. Inside, more than 40 gold bars and at least 4,000 old coins. Estimated value around 9 million euros, roughly $10 million. The person who actually spotted it was an 18-year-old student named Kobe, working the excavation. And here's what he and the crew did next, which is the part I keep thinking about. They called the police. They didn't pocket a bar. They didn't divide it quietly among themselves. They stopped work and called the authorities, who inventoried the cash and moved it into a high-security vault operated by the Belgian federal government. The texture is the mystery underneath it. Nobody knows who hid it, when, or how old the coins are. A brewer lived in the building around 1900, and local reporting has floated a connection to a wealthy brewing family, but there's no evidence tying that resident to the chest. Someone walled up $10 million in gold and then apparently never came back for it, which means either they couldn't or something happened that made it impossible. Why it matters, in the smallest and most human sense. The workers have expressed hope for a finder's reward, and no decision has been announced. Belgian law on treasure trove is not especially generous. Second order. The discovery has become a live test of whether doing the honest thing gets rewarded institutionally or just morally. It surfaced this week because the story went global almost instantly, with search interest up 500 to 600% in under a day.
$10 million sat behind a wall for a century because somebody hid it too well. The perfect security system is indistinguishable from losing it.
Let's move from found money to money that's carefully calculated. New estimates for the 2027 Social Security cost of living adjustment came out this week, and they're falling. Independent analyst Mary Johnson now puts it at 3.4%, down from 3.7% last month, which was itself down from 4.7% in June. The Senior Citizens League has it at 3.6%. AARP has it at 3.5%. The mechanism matters here. The COLA is calculated by comparing third quarter inflation, July, August, September, against the same quarter the prior year. The July CPI print, which came out on the 12th, is the first of 3 inputs. September 11th gives the second. October 14th finalizes it. So the number is still moving, and it's been moving in one direction all summer. Here's the texture. A falling COLA estimate is technically good news, dressed as bad news. It means inflation is moderating, which is what everyone said they wanted. But for roughly 70 million beneficiaries, the COLA is not an inflation statistic. it's next year's raise. Watching your raise shrink by 1 1/3 percentage points over 2 months does not feel like a victory, even when the underlying cause is a win. And the estimate is still well above the long run average COLA of around 2.6%. Why it matters beyond the household level. The COLA is one of the largest single automatic adjustments in federal spending. Second order, it feeds directly into the trust fund depletion math, which shifts by year when the adjustment runs hotter or cooler than the trustees assumed. It surfaced this week because the July CPI print landed and every forecaster revised at once.
Your cost of living raise going down because your cost of living went up more slowly is the most honest description of the last 4 years I can offer.
Another cost that's harder to see is the one embedded in shipping. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed to routine commercial traffic since a U.S.-Iran memorandum broke down in early July, following attacks on commercial vessels. And the number that tells the story isn't the oil price, it's the insurance. War risk premiums for tankers transiting Hormuz have gone from roughly 0.25% of hull value before hostilities to somewhere between 7.5% and 10% now. Put that in dollars. A $100 million tanker that used to pay about $250,000 for war risk cover is now looking at $7.5 to $10 million per voyage. According to Marsh and other brokers, underwriters have grown so reluctant that in some windows, coverage simply hasn't been available at any price. The texture is what happens when insurance stops being a market. When the premium goes up 30-fold, the ship doesn't sail cheaper. It doesn't sail. Tanker traffic dropped roughly 70% at the peak, with more than 150 vessels anchored outside the strait waiting. The World Economic Forum has written about governments stepping in as insurers of last resort, which is the point at which a private risk has become a public balance sheet item. Why it matters is that insurance is the actual choke point, not the waterway. Second order, watch tanker day rates and the freight component of refined product spreads, because that's where the premium shows up before it reaches a pump. It surfaced this week because premiums firmed again, and the strait status remains unresolved heading into the new week.
The strait isn't closed by mines or missiles. It's closed by an actuary who ran the numbers and stopped answering the phone.
1 in 50. That's the share of salaried job openings in America that now qualify as entry-level, according to new data from the workforce firm Cadient, down roughly 73% over 4 years. The bottom rung didn't get harder to reach. It's being quietly removed. Unemployment among recent college graduates aged 22 to 27 has climbed to about 5.7%, per the New York Fed, which is higher than the rate for the workforce as a whole. That hasn't been true in decades. Underemployment in that same group sits around 42%, meaning 4 in 10 are working jobs that never required the degree they're still paying for. Handshake's campus data fills in the shape of it. Listings down 15 to 16% year over year. Applications per posting up 26 to 30. Same doorway, half as wide, twice as many people pushing. The reflex is to blame automation, and the numbers are genuinely ugly at firms that adopted generative AI. But the flat decline across healthcare, trades, and business operations, where postings are actually up 13 points, argues for something more ordinary. Companies stopped paying to train people. Apprenticeship was always the real product of an entry-level job, and it's expensive, and it got cut. Forbes and the Economic Policy Institute both landed on this in the past 2 weeks as the class of 2026 finished its first summer of looking. Which raises a question nobody's costing out. If no one pays for year 1, who's qualified in year 5?
Every senior hire your company wants in 2031 is a junior. Somebody declined to train this August.
Now to a corner of the media business that just got a new source of capital. The Canada Media Fund opened its 2026 and 2027 budget cycle this month with money explicitly available to video podcast creators, part of a broader shift in which streaming platforms and traditional media funds are financing podcasts as visual talk shows rather than audio programs. The strategic logic is straightforward. Gen Z consumes podcasts primarily through video clips, not audio feeds, and platforms that need original talk format programming have discovered that a 2-person podcast set costs a fraction of a scripted series and generates far more cuttable short-form inventory per hour. Here's the texture. This inverts the industry's original economics. Podcasting grew for 15 years on the premise that audio was cheap, portable, and platform independent. You could make it in a closet, and nobody owned your distribution. Video financing reverses all three. It's expensive, it's not portable, and the money comes with a platform attached. Meanwhile, Podchaser data points to a counterintuitive backdrop. Fewer new shows are launching than in prior years, but breaking out has gotten harder, not easier. Why it matters is that the creator economy is reconsolidating around whoever pays for production. Second order, watch the tooling layer. Multicam podcast studios, clip generation software, and rights management get pulled along by the format shift, and those are the picks and shovels businesses in this cycle. It surfaced this week because the funding cycle formally opened, and the industry press covered the eligibility change.
The moment somebody else pays for your camera, you've traded independence for reach. And most people don't notice they made the trade.
Last one, and it's the least glamorous piece of market plumbing you'll hear about today. OTC Markets Group, the company that operates the over-the-counter markets, ticker OTCM, has been quietly building extended hours and overnight trading infrastructure, including its Moon ATS and the OTC overnight session. And it's been capturing meaningful international order flow across Asia-Pacific and Europe-Middle East-Africa corridors. The specific insight is about time zones. If you're a retail investor in Singapore or Dubai, U.S. market hours fall in the middle of your night. For decades, the answer was too bad. An overnight session means an investor in Manila can trade a U.S.-listed name during Manila business hours. That's not a product feature. That's an addressable market expansion. The texture is that this is the second time the OTC market has quietly built infrastructure the main exchanges eventually adopted. Extended hours trading, fractional access, alternative trading systems. The pattern is that the fringe venue builds it, proves demand, and then the incumbents announce it as innovation. OTCM itself is a small, profitable, boring company that most investors have never looked at, which is generally where this kind of thing gets built. Why it matters is that continuous global trading changes overnight gap risk for everyone, including people who never trade at 3 a.m. Second order, if overnight volume keeps growing, price discovery migrates out of the 9:30 open, and every strategy calibrated to the U.S. session has to be recalibrated. It surfaced this week because international volume across those corridors logged a fresh breakout that showed up in the company's own reporting. That's what you didn't see in the news. Now let's wake up ready. Let's start with the main event. Wednesday the 20th brings the minutes from the July FOMC meeting, and this is the first set of minutes under Kevin Warsh that markets will read closely for internal dissent. Don't read them for the policy decision. You already know rates were held. Read them for the count. Specifically, look for how the minutes characterize the participants who signaled support for higher rates, and whether the language moves from some participants to several or many. That's the tell. Here's what's already priced. 9 of the 18 participants signaled support for higher rates in 2026, a sharp reversal from March when 0 did, and the committee's median forecast was for 1 cut. Markets now put the odds of at least 1 hike by year-end at roughly 60%. So a hawkish minutes is not a surprise. A hawkish minutes with a widening coalition is. The second-order consequence. If the language hardens, the pressure lands on the front end first. Watch 2-year yields and the 2-to-10 spread. A flattening driven by the front end is what reprices long-duration growth equities and regional bank net interest margins in opposite directions.
The decision was already public. The vote count is the part nobody's published yet.
Then comes 3 straight days of the American consumer. Home Depot reports Tuesday, Target and Lowe's Wednesday, Walmart Thursday. 4 companies, roughly 48 hours, and a fairly complete cross-section of household spending from home improvement to groceries to discretionary retail. The signal isn't the earnings beat, it's the composition of the guidance language. Specifically, listen for whether management frames the next 2 quarters around traffic and unit growth or around cost containment, shrink, and tariff pass-through. Home Depot and Lowe's read the housing and renovation cycle. Target and Walmart read the trade-down behavior. What's priced? The market has already accepted margin pressure from elevated fuel and freight costs and has broadly assumed continued trade down into private label. Consensus is not expecting a volume story. The second-order consequence. If the guidance is dominated by cost containment rather than demand, the leverage shows up in small-cap consumer discretionary before it shows up in the large caps. That's where domestic spending sensitivity actually lives. and it's the first cohort to reprice. If Walmart's comp traffic holds while Target slips again, that's not a retail story. It's a confirmation that the trade down is still deepening.
4 companies in 3 days will tell you more about the household balance sheet than any survey printed this quarter.
Third, the global growth picture, which lands almost entirely on Thursday and Friday. Thursday brings the People's Bank of China rate decision and Australia's employment report. Friday brings preliminary S&P global PMI readings for Germany, the Euro area, the United Kingdom, and the United States, plus UK retail sales. The specific signal to watch is the German manufacturing new orders subindex, not the headline PMI. Germany is the transmission point between Chinese industrial demand and European industrial capacity, and new orders lead output by roughly a quarter. If the PBOC eases Thursday and German new orders are still contracting Friday, you've learned that Chinese stimulus is no longer reaching European order books, which is a structural change and not a monthly wobble. What's priced? The Euro area composite PMI has been hovering near the 50 line, and consensus expects roughly stable readings. Markets are positioned for muddling through. The second-order consequence: if German new orders roll over while the PBOC eases, expect European industrials and autos to underperform, the euro to soften against the dollar, and the entire European recovery trade that built through the spring to unwind. It also raises the probability that the ECB moves before the Fed does, which widens rate differentials in the dollar's favor.
Watch the sub-index, not the headline. The headline is an average of things that are moving in opposite directions.
Fourth, capital markets, and this one has a name and a number attached. The biotech IPO window didn't just open this month, it proved itself. Braveheart Bio, a cardiovascular disease biotech, upsized its offering and priced above the range to raise $383 million at a $1.6 billion market cap on NASDAQ. Latigo Biotherapeutics, priced around $272 million at roughly a $1 billion valuation. Blossom Hill came in near $125 million. 3 clinical stage names, 1 month, all in the same therapeutic platform lane. Here's the theme, named explicitly. This is the return of pre-revenue clinical risk to the public markets. Not profitable companies going public, companies whose entire value is a trial readout. That capital had been locked in private crossover rounds for 2 years. What's priced? The aftermarket is the referee. Braveheart pricing above the range tells you institutional books were oversubscribed, which typically pulls the next wave of S1 filings forward by 4 to 6 weeks. The second-order consequence, and this is the part worth watching in the week ahead. If these names hold above issue, expect a visible acceleration in confidential filings from the crossover-funded biotech backlog into September. If they break issue, the window shuts before Labor Day, and those companies go back to structured private rounds at flat or down valuations. Watch the small-cap biotech index as the read-through. The XBI-type cohort trades as a proxy for whether the exit path is real, and it's the vehicle most retail participants will actually use to express the view.
An IPO priced above the range isn't a company story. It's a permission slip for everyone still standing in line behind it.
Fifth, the geopolitical file, and it's the same one it's been since February. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed to routine commercial traffic. The specific thing to watch this week is not the oil price and not a diplomatic statement. It's the war risk insurance quote. Track whether additional war risk premiums hold in the 7.5% to 10% of hull value range or start to firm above 10. What's priced? The market has largely accepted a persistent risk premium and rerouting costs. What it has not priced is a sustained inability to obtain coverage at any price, which is a different regime entirely. The second-order consequence: if premiums push above 10% and underwriters withdraw further, the constraint moves from cost to availability, and refined product cracks widen faster than crude does. That's the trade, the spread between crude and the products, not crude itself. Watch tanker day rates for confirmation and watch airline fuel hedging disclosures because carriers that hedged early in the year are about to look very different from carriers that didn't.
Nobody blockades a strait anymore. They just make it uninsurable, which is cheaper and works better.
And my personal watch for this week, the Jackson Hole prepositioning. The symposium itself runs August 27th through the 29th, with Kevin Warsh delivering his first keynote as chair, and the theme this year is financial innovation and its implications for payments and policy. That's not a monetary policy theme, that's a plumbing theme. which means the interesting question isn't what Warsh says about rates. It's whether a Fed chair who's spent months talking about inflation credibility uses his first Jackson Hole to talk about payment rails, settlement, and who gets access to the central bank's balance sheet. The positioning trades happen this week before he speaks. Watch the pre-commentary, not the speech.
And that is how you wake up ready. All right, knowledge bomb. There's a quiet shift happening in the path to home ownership. And it's not just about higher prices. It's about the hidden math of transition. Because for most of modern history, the story was simple. Save 20%, close, move in. Ownership as a clear finish line. Now the finish line keeps moving. As of mid-2026, first-time buyers still make up about a third of all purchases. People are still getting there. They're just arriving later, across generations, and with a different kind of discipline. The critical insight isn't the down payment, it's the total cash required to cross the threshold without breaking. The 20% rule is largely a myth. Conventional loans often allow 3 to 5% down. FHA sits at 3.5%, but that number alone is incomplete. Closing costs add another 2 to 5% of the purchase price. Lender fees, title appraisals, prepaid taxes. Earnest money demands 1 to 3% liquid the moment an offer is accepted. It later credits toward the down payment, yet it's got to exist first. So the real target isn't the down payment, it's the full cash to close number. Miss that, and the closing table becomes a surprise you can't afford. Then come the transition costs that never appear on the listing. Condo living brings HOA dues. Low reserves in the association can trigger special assessments, sudden mandatory bills measured in thousands. And the shift from renter to owner rewires monthly reality. The landlord doesn't fix the HVAC anymore. You do. A separate maintenance buffer becomes essential. Here's the practical lever that changes behavior, the test drive strategy. If rent's $1,500 and the projected mortgage plus HOA is $2,200, start living on the higher number now. Automatically move the difference into savings on the first of every month. The budget gets stress tested in real time. The fund grows without drama. Discipline is rehearsed before the stakes rise. Once the target's clear, the system matters. Isolate the money in a high-yield savings account. Keep it separate from daily checking so friction protects it. Automate the transfers. Capture windfalls, tax refunds, bonuses, proceeds from selling what you no longer need, and route them straight into the fund. Explore state and local first-time buyer programs that can shrink the cash required at closing. The data shows the window never closed, it simply widened. Among Gen Z buyers, 62% are purchasing for the first time. Younger millennials, 71%. Older millennials, 36%. Even Gen X still sees more than half of its buyers as first-timers in recent reports. Home ownership is no longer a narrow age gate. It's a multi-generational process of accumulation and readiness. Buying later isn't failure. It's often the result of deliberate stabilization, career, reserves, clarity on the true cost. The principle's straightforward. Ownership isn't a single number. It's a complete transition. Cash, cash flow, and the capacity to absorb the unexpected. Define the full cash to close. Rehearse the new monthly reality. Protect the fund. Capture every surplus. Because the greatest risk isn't missing the down payment. It's arriving at the closing table without enough clarity or enough cash to finish what you started. And that's your knowledge bomb.
Humor me. You ever notice that in markets, we'll argue for 3 hours over the precise definition of fair value? But when it comes to the word poor, America just keeps inventing new versions, like it's a product roadmap with unlimited feature requests. Official poverty measure, supplemental poverty measure, relative to median, material hardship, asset poverty, deep poverty, program eligibility poverty, and my personal favorite, the technically above the line, but still praying the transmission doesn't die this month measure. We've turned poverty into a choose-your-own-adventure novel. Pick your metric, and you can make the number go up, go down, or disappear entirely, depending on which dashboard you're looking at. It's the only economic statistic that feels like it was designed by a committee that also invents new streaming service tiers and then charges extra for the ability to pause. And then there's the classic American plot twist, living paycheck to paycheck. That's the version where your income's high enough that the Census Bureau politely declines to call you poor, while your bank account still treats every unexpected expense like a margin call. You can clear the official poverty line, clear the supplemental line, and still be one cracked windshield away from becoming a case study in cash flow insolvency with a side of middle class branding. The system's incentives are almost elegant in their absurdity. We celebrate rising median incomes while half the country's running a zero duration fixed income portfolio called rent, groceries, and hoping the car doesn't notice. If this keeps going, the next measure will be something called narrative poverty. You're not broke, you're just in a prolonged character development arc. Or vibe poverty, where the algorithm decides you're struggling based on how many times you open your banking app before noon. We'll eventually get subscription poverty, defined as the point at which the monthly auto renewals outnumber the actual paychecks. At that stage, the only remaining metric will be whether your credit card rewards points can still buy emotional stability. The real joke is that while we're busy cataloging 8 different ways to be poor, the market only ever cares about one number: how much dry powder you actually have when the music stops. Everything else is just elegant footnotes on the same uncomfortable truth. Liquidity is the only definition that never needs a revision.
There are debates that clear a dinner table, and there are debates that clear a government building. It's time for the greater debate. This is the second kind, because one side says the voters decided, the other side says the voters don't know where the valves are, and suddenly every civil servant in the room remembers they've got a meeting. 2 lecterns, no slides, no moderator to rescue anyone. The room's waiting, not empty. At the first lectern, Andrew Jackson, defender of political rotation, democratic control, and the ancient conviction that an election ought to change something before the next election arrives. At the second, Theodore Roosevelt, civil service reformer, institutionalist, and believer that a modern state can't be operated as a victory banquet where the jobs are dessert. The resolution sounds cynical. The spoils system is an ineradicable feature of politics. Underneath it sits a harder question: who governs after the voters have governed? Jackson begins quietly. He doesn't raise his voice. Call it the spoils system because you want the public to imagine sacks of coins passed beneath the table. I call it accountability. A president's elected on a promise. He arrives and finds the departments charged with carrying out that promise staffed by people appointed, promoted, and culturally formed under previous administrations. They don't openly rebel. They do something more effective. They request another review. They raise a procedural concern. They schedule the decision for next quarter. Pauses. A protected bureaucracy doesn't have to defeat a president. It merely has to outlast him. There's a knowing laugh, the sound of people who've met a committee. If the voter can replace the executive, but the executive can't redirect the administration, then the ceremony of democracy remains while its mechanism's been removed. Political loyalty isn't always corruption. Sometimes it's the transmission belt between a public decision and a public result. Roosevelt waits, then answers without indignation. A transmission belt's only useful if it's attached to the right machinery. Government isn't one machine. It's thousands of systems accumulated across generations. Defense procurement, disease surveillance, air traffic control, nuclear security, benefit payments, intelligence networks, financial plumbing, and computer code old enough to qualify for a pension. Remove the experienced operators every 4 years, and your president enjoys perfect alignment with people who can't find the valves. The room laughs, then quiets. Institutional memory isn't an insult to democracy. It's what keeps each election from becoming national amnesia. Expertise doesn't decide the destination. It keeps the bridge standing while elected leaders argue about where the road should go. Jackson turns slightly toward him. And who examines the experts? Career officials spend decades regulating the same industries, attending the same conferences, learning the same language as the people they oversee. They may never accept a bribe. Capture can happen more politely than that. It arrives through shared assumptions, professional friendships, and the belief that only insiders understand what's realistic. He presses. Rotation breaks those closed circles. It brings in people who've knocked on doors and lived under rules they didn't write. Your merit system congratulates itself for replacing political connections with examinations, then acts surprised when government fills with people from the same schools, the same cities, and the same social class. That lands a few people applaud before catching themselves. Jackson's found the reformers' exposed flank, a system built to eliminate favoritism, can quietly redefine privilege as qualification. Roosevelt nods. He doesn't dodge it. Merit systems can become narrow. Credentials can masquerade as competence. Employment protections can shelter indifference. I concede all of it. Governments tolerated processes where removing a persistently poor performer takes longer than constructing the building where the hearing will be held. Reformers who deny that invite a harsher reform later. Then his voice hardens. But patronage doesn't transfer power to ordinary citizens. It transfers power to whoever hands out the jobs, the ward boss, the donor, the campaign lieutenant. You don't abolish an elite. You replace a professional elite with a personal court. A murmur moves across the room. He reaches back to the event that made patronage indefensible, President Garfield, shot by a deranged and disappointed office seeker, and the Pendleton Act that followed in 1883. Your system makes public office a private currency. Every appointment creates a debt. Every dismissal creates an enemy. The government becomes a campaign organization that happens to deliver the mail. Jackson answers immediately. And yours makes public office a possession. Once secured, nearly immune to the public's changing judgment. You fear the president's favorites. I fear officials nobody elected, governing by delay, interpretation, and selective enforcement. Neutral administration's an aspiration, not a human condition. Every official has beliefs. Insulation doesn't remove politics. It moves politics farther from the ballot box. The room goes very still. This is Jackson's hardest blow. If expertise necessarily contains judgment, then protecting experts can protect a political program no voter can remove. Roosevelt doesn't flinch. Yes, administration contains judgment. That's why it needs law, oversight, and professional ethics. But consider your alternative. If an analyst knows an unwelcome forecast may end his career, the forecast improves mysteriously before it reaches the president. If an attorney's employment depends on finding a policy legal, legal analysis becomes customer service. If an intelligence officer must demonstrate personal alignment, threats get measured by appetite instead of evidence. He lets it sit. Your bureaucracy may move quickly, General Jackson, because every warning light's been disconnected. A gasp, then silence, not empty this time, tight. Jackson pauses before replying. That's a genuine danger. A government of flatterers can execute a foolish policy with extraordinary efficiency. Expertise can't be replenished on election day, and a wholesale purge would destroy capabilities the president himself needs. I don't defend incompetence dressed as loyalty, but neither should expertise become a veto. The official's duty is to give honest advice, identify illegality, and then faithfully execute every lawful decision. When an employee substitutes his own policy for the elected one, protections become power without responsibility. Now the debate steps out of history and into the present. The old Schedule F controversy has returned under a less theatrical name, Schedule Policy Career. In June of 2026, roughly 8,000 policy-influencing positions were reclassified. Still career, still merit-filled, but stripped of important procedural protections against dismissal. Jackson points at the distinction. These aren't campaign jobs. Political loyalty tests remain prohibited. The question's whether senior officials who shape policy can be held accountable when they obstruct it. A president who can't remove the hands on the levers doesn't control the machine. Roosevelt sees the same distinction and finds it unstable. Selection and removal can't be separated so neatly. Tell a career official that political affiliation can't determine hiring, but continued employment depends on satisfying political leadership, and the loyalty test simply moves from the application to the conference room. Quieter, harder to prove, more effective. The first dismissals teach everyone else which truths are expensive. Jackson offers his knockout with almost no flourish. Then admit what your model requires. The public may elect new management, but the permanent government reserves the right to decide how much change is responsible. That isn't administration serving democracy, it's administration supervising democracy. Roosevelt answers just as cleanly. And admit what yours requires. Every president must be trusted not only with lawful authority, but with the power to decide which inconvenient facts count as disloyalty. That isn't accountability, it's obedience wearing a government badge. Neither man speaks for a moment. Jackson finally concedes that patronage gravitates toward corruption because jobs are valuable and politicians are human. Roosevelt concedes that protection gravitates toward stagnation for precisely the same reason. The audience has stopped looking for a hero. Here's what they were actually arguing about. Jackson was asking, how does a public decision become a public result? Roosevelt was asking, how does a government keep knowing what's true? Those aren't the same question. And no single staffing rule answers both. The spoils system may be ineradicable, not because every public job has to become a political prize, but because elections inevitably create pressure for control, while institutions inevitably create pressure for independence. Push too far toward permanence, and government becomes a fortress against the voter. Push too far toward loyalty, and it becomes an echo chamber around the president. So the real contest was never politics against a politics-free civil service. No such clean border exists. It's between two kinds of failure: a state that can't change course, and a state that can change course with nobody left inside willing or able to say where the rocks are. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. By the middle of the 1930s, surgery had gotten good at almost everything except the beginning of it. The cutting had improved. Sterile technique had improved. Recovery had improved. But the moment of going under hadn't changed much in 80 years. Ether and chloroform still ruled the operating room, and patients hated them with a specificity that's rare in medicine. The mask coming down, the choking vapor, the struggle against a rising fog you couldn't fight and couldn't escape. Then the nausea afterward, and the delirium, and for some people a psychic residue that lasted long after the incision healed. Everyone knew there had to be a better way in. Something injected rather than inhaled. Something that would take effect smoothly and leave the patient without the sense of having been chemically besieged. Knowing that, and finding it, turned out to be different problems entirely. Ernest Vollweiler wasn't a dramatic man. Born in Hamilton, Ohio in 1893, he moved through the ordinary academic stations, Miami University, then Illinois for his master's and his doctorate, and joined Abbott Laboratories as a researcher in 1918. Methodical, patient, unflashy. Those traits would end up mattering more than brilliance, because the work he took on didn't reward brilliance, it rewarded endurance. He and his colleague Donnelly Tabern set out to find an injectable agent that could produce reliable unconsciousness without the violence of inhalation. Over 3 years, they screened more than 200 compounds. The work was iterative and largely thankless. Most candidates failed in the usual ways: too slow, too rough, too toxic, or accompanied by muscle twitching and frightening mental effects. Prevailing wisdom favored polishing the existing barbiturates rather than departing from them. They kept going anyway. In 1936, they arrived at a sulfur-bearing analog of Nembutal. The compound became known as pentothal, sodium thiopental, and it did something none of the 200 near misses had managed. It slipped the patient under with almost no struggle. Induction was smooth and, by every account, pleasant. Little or no twitching, none of the delirium that had made ether an ordeal. For short procedures, it could stand alone. For longer ones, it eased the patient gently into deeper anesthesia with other agents. That combination of speed, comfort, and control mattered immediately. Hospitals adopted it because it cut the trauma of going under and gave the anesthetist finer command of the process. Patients who dreaded the mask now faced a needle. Surgeons got a more cooperative field. Vollweiler rose through Abbott, director of research, then president, eventually chairman of the board of Abbott Laboratories International. And pentothal became the agent of choice in operating rooms around the world for decades. Here's the unexpected consequence, and it's the part that connects to everything else in this episode. Vollweiler and Tabern didn't invent a new category of medicine. They improved the doorway. Ether already worked. The destination was fine. What was missing was a tolerable way to cross the threshold. And once that crossing got cheaper in human terms, the entire surgical enterprise on the other side of it became more productive. Longer procedures became feasible. Patients who'd been putting off operations stopped putting them off. The bottleneck was never the surgery. It was the entry cost. That's a pattern worth noticing, because it shows up constantly and gets credited almost never. The breakthrough often isn't a complete new system. It's a better interface between a capability that already exists and a human limitation that's been quietly rationing access to it. 200 compounds failed. They weren't wasted. Each one taught the constraint. The one that finally fit didn't look revolutionary on paper. It just removed a friction everybody else had normalized. And there's a quieter lesson about incentives underneath it. Abbott was a commercial laboratory, not a pure research institute. Vollweiler spent 3 years on work that mostly produced nothing, in an environment that rewards visible milestones. That's exactly where the useful edge tends to hide. After the obvious candidates are exhausted and the remaining work looks incremental and unglamorous. Vollweiler lived until 1992, long enough to watch the operating room transform many times over. Propofol and other agents have long since displaced thiopental for most procedures. But every one of those successors was measured, at least partly against the standard he set. He never claimed to have reinvented medicine. He and Tabern simply made the entry into unconsciousness less brutal, and that single improvement compounded quietly for 60 years until it became invisible, which is what infrastructure does once it works. In 1936, though, it wasn't obvious at all. It was just a chemist in Illinois, 200 failures deep, still asking what it actually costs to walk through the door. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. From melting diamonds to gold behind a brewery wall, from the cost of a tanker's transit to the cost of a closing table, and from the price of an election to the price of falling asleep, the pattern was simple. Entry has a price.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Till next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.